This video on the Canadian political system will focus on the people, specifically political parties. And I'm going to first do an overview of political parties and then discuss briefly the party organization and then go over the party systems, which is a very important concept for the study of Canadian politics. First, an overview. Of course, political parties are organized groups that contest elections to win public office. They serve several political functions, they aggregate and articulate the public interest, and they structure the political dialogue. In Canada, as in most democracies, we can talk about two types of parties: brokerage-based parties, which act as mediators between Canada's numerous social cleavages, and by this we mean regional identity, class, ethnicity, religion, gender, and so on and so forth. All types of different identities that are expressed. The typical behavior for a brokerage-based party is to aim for the middle, to gain as many supporters as possible. These parties tend to be large. They tend to try to win elections in the sense that they actually have a shot at forming a government after an election. And because they have such a broad base, they will invariably include a really great number, a really great diversity of supporters that all have to get along in some way. So there will be a great deal of compromise to make sure that everyone can feel accommodated within the scope of the party as a whole. The second type of party is the ideological or class-based party. The ideological party, programmatic party, we could call it too, tends to be more rooted in ideological orthodoxy. And because of that, it tends to be smaller. It tends to be more ideological pure. It tends to stick to its ideological roots and ideals with greater loyalty, but because of that, it tends to be smaller. It tends to have a difficult time breaking out of third or fourth party status because of that. And so this is really a trade-off for a political party. Should it seek to become as large as possible and then dilute its ideological heritage because of the compromise needed to attract so many voters and supporters, or should it stick to its ideological roots and then very probably, possibly, be locked out of the chance of actually forming government? The typical brokerage-based parties in Canadian politics in history have been the Liberals and the Conservatives that have been the really big parties for the longest time. And the NDP has been the more ideological party, a smaller party. The Greens could be seen as this as well, as a programmatic party in that sense. And we saw after the 2011 election how the NDP became the new official opposition. And very soon afterwards, it dropped the socialist label. And this is, I would argue, a clear sign of how it's moving towards becoming a brokerage-based party away from its ideological roots, precisely because here's an opportunity, a chance for the NDP to actually contest elections with a reasonable chance of forming a government the next time. It has never had a better chance of doing so, given its position as the official opposition. And if it wants to do it, it has to win the middle. And to win the middle, compromise is necessary, and then it starts behaving more like a brokerage-based party to reflecting this new position. So this is the attention that any party has to take into account. Should it remain more ideological pure? People who don't like brokerage type politics will critique it because of too much compromise. People who want to win office and think that this is the most important part tend to critique those who are more ideologically pure for not being flexible enough and not being willing to compromise enough to actually win office. So that's a continuous tension within party politics between larger parties and smaller parties. Party organizations have rules and regulations that involve the party membership. Of course, a few Canadians are actually members of political parties, but those who do are very important for the party as they volunteer time and money for it. There's also regulation about the leadership selection, which over time has grown more inclusive, and there's also regulation around policymaking, And this is really where you have these tensions between factions within any given political party about how it should manage its ideological history, its ideological core, and how to win office, and the tension that often arise between these two. Also, there are rules about operation, about annual conventions. They tend to have an executive, some have headquarters. Party elites tend to have a great deal of influence, even in local ridings, and of course, in terms of who gets nominated to run in a local riding. A final note here concerns the party systems. This is a concept that scholars studying Canadian politics have discussed quite extensively. Party systems here meaning the makeup of the number of hard parties in the House of Commons, how large they are, which are the large parties, which are the small parties, and the stability of which these parties on the federal stage are. The different party systems can be differentiated by how many parties are contesting elections, how they strategize, and the tenures of different prime ministers. Four party systems tend to be identified. The first being in the earliest era, just after Confederation, up to just after the First World War, which was the first party system, which was a two-party system, certainly after 1896. Really just two political parties, liberals and conservatives, and they set the agenda for politics federally for everyone. That was the alternatives for the voters. They just dominated the stage. After 1921, we see a shift and we go then over to the second party system. The liberals and conservatives were still the major parties, still dominant, but we now see the 2+ or 2.5 party system because smaller parties managed to gain seats, not sufficient numbers of seats to offset the liberals or conservatives, but changing the dynamics in the House of Commons to some extent anyway. It's no longer just two parties, it's now two parties and the one or maybe a couple minor ones. Some of these minor ones were very temporary, didn't last very long, others lasted a little bit longer. But that was kind of the character of politics during the second party system that you had one or so smaller regional third party and liberals and conservatives. And then in the mid 20th century, we see another shift towards the third party system, which ended really the liberal party dominance. So in this time, we see alternating governments. We have liberals and conservatives taking turn at forming the government. They're still, both of them, the major parties. Liberals might be in office a little bit more than the conservatives, but it's certainly alternating. And some stability here in which the third party would be, with the NDP becoming an entrenched national party and having more of a continuity over time. After 1993, that's another one of these watershed moments in Canadian politics. We see the collapse of the Conservative Party. We see in the 1990s the Bloc Québécois being a significant presence on the federal stage. We see, for a while, actually 5 political parties that really fractured the vote. 2 right-wing parties, the Reform Party and the Canadian Alliance. Then we see a mix of majority and minority governments. So first, we have 3 consecutive liberal majorities, and then we have a series of minority governments, including, of course, Harper's minority governments, after he managed to pull the Conservatives together to be just the one party again. So that's a way that the relations between political parties, their different size, and stability for a periodic stability, have characterized Canadian politics. So we can't talk about the same dynamics characterizing Canadian politics throughout its entire history. Rather, it's a series of different eras, each with its own stability and its own logic, one following after the other. So that's an overview of Canadian political parties and how that part of the Canadian political system works. I hope you found it useful.